adult usually manage. So it's a chronic inflammation of gut, largely classified as Crohn's disease, ulcerative colitis, or inflammatory bowel disease, unclassified. Diagnosis of pediatric onset IBD is often challenging. And the differentiation of Crohn's disease from ulcerative colitis and both of these from infectious disease, allergic diseases, and primary immunodeficiency with similar presentation is based largely on different features. Like we have to amalgamate all the features to come to a diagnosis. Clinical suspicion, ruling out other diagnoses, endoscopic and histological evaluation of the mucosa, small bowel imaging or endoscopy, and clinical and whole exome sequencing for very early onset or refractory IBDs. So previously we never used to discuss about whole exome sequencing in IBD, but now it is becoming essential whenever we are dealing with very early onset and refractory diseases. So it's often slow growing. It's very, very slow growing, and it's often very difficult to suspect from the very beginning because the first presentation of infectious colitis might be the first presentation of an ulcerative colitis. So it's difficult to differentiate. So that's why still average time to diagnose the disease is 6 to 9 months. Oral ulceration, joint pain, skin manifestation, eye manifestation, all these can be present for long period, even years, without any abdominal symptoms. So that's why people may not suspect diseases. So what is the pathogenesis? As a whole, the pathogenesis is multifactorial, except the very early onset that I will come later on. So mostly it's some genetic predisposition with mucosal immune system abnormality, especially involving the microbiota, and then environmental factors. Environmental factors might involve dietary factors as well as other environmental influences. And the genetics has been actually being studied and still being studied for a long time to find out the typical association. You have some association with the genes, like single nuclear polymorphism of particular genes, but it also depends on the age of onset. Because more association with these genes in adult onset IBD than pediatric onset. And pediatric very early onset diseases are often associated with immunodeficiency genes. So different studies have differentiated different genes, but most of the pathways which are involving is the IL-23 receptor gene, IL-10 receptor gene pathway, and IL-12 and STAT3 genes. And other immunological genes like CARD15, that is NOT2, or ATG16. These are very well involved and more studied in adult population. So what happens when there is this association with the genetic factors and some environmental trigger? Whenever there is environmental trigger and then active injury occurs, that can actually end with an acute inflammation and ultimate response, and tolerance develops and the host becomes normal again. But if there is loss of tolerance, failure of repair due to all these multi-factors which I have already discussed, it can be a chronic inflammation. So ultimately this gives rise to the IBD. So age distribution, if you see, we always see a bimodal age distribution. We are concerned with those who are having onset less than 20 years, and there is second peak usually occurs about above 40 years usually, but mostly 50 to 80 years. Approximately 25% of the patients present before 20 years. So pediatric onset disease is a good chunk of disease of inflammatory bowel disease. So it may begin as early as first year of life, or an increased incidence among young children has been noted, especially of Crohn's disease, as we have actually turned on the century. After 2000, actually the disease has been increasing all over the world. So if you see that there were several other classifications previously, but according to age, the Paris classification says the pediatric onset IBD might be with these types. One is pediatric onset, that is any IBD which is less than 17-year-old. Previous Montreal classification or Vienna classification also used to say that IBD below 17 years or 17 to 40 years. So this is pediatric onset. Then what is early onset? Early onset is anybody having IBD below 10 years. Very early onset, anybody having IBD below 6 years. And we have infantile onset as well, that is below 2 years. And neonatal onset is one of the rarest group, within 28 days it starts. So children with very early onset disease, please keep that in mind. And those below 1 year have a high incidence of monogenic causes. So these are not those typical multifactorial occurrence. These are usually monogenic gene or single nuclear factor polymorphism in a particular gene. So we have to really think of whether we are dealing with particular immunodeficiency syndromes. So let's start with few cases. Some might be popular to you have seen these cases, and then I will discuss about the whole disease. First, we start with 6-year-old girl. She had history of repeated abdominal pain for last 5 months. Each episode of pain was associated with fever. 2 episodes of hospital admission in last 1 month, and weight loss of 2 kg in last 5 months. It was not very exorbitant weight loss, but there was weight loss. There was loss of energy. She was not feeling like going to school, and there was no family history of anything significant like this. How was the pain? Pain was dull as well as colicky, not relieved by usually anticolic medicines. Food sometimes exaggerating pain, no vomiting, sometimes tenesmus-like and followed by mucoid bowel movement, initially lasting for 5 to 6 days fortnightly, but gradually increased to most of the days per week. And nocturnal pain was present. Fever, how was the fever? Fever usually followed pain reaching about 100 to 203 degree Fahrenheit, 2 to 3 times a day. No rigor or chill. Relief by paracetamol lasted for 4 to 5 days with severity. As long as the pain was very severe, the fever usually lasts for those days. And every time she used to receive some amount of antibiotics, and fever used to subside. So everybody used to think that it might be an infection, and that ultimately responds to some antibiotics. So one fever episode was associated with respiratory symptoms along with abdominal pain. And that time, somebody thought that it might be a case of tuberculosis. So investigation was all done according to that line as well. So initial investigation, there was CBC, CRP, LFT, serology, chest X-ray, blood culture, Mantoux, ultrasound. These were all already done. So what was that? Those investigations showed? Those investigations showed hemoglobin always low, slight neutropenia, CRP always high, average was 25, and sometimes it was more in one episode. LFT was mostly normal, except albumin was gradually coming down, and last albumin was 3.4. Chest X-ray was normal, Mantoux was non-reactive, ultrasound showed multiple mesenteric lymphadenopathy, and highest was 2 centimeter. And quite a number of 2 centimeter lymph nodes were present. When we examined the child was quite alert, but she was pale. There was no jaundice, but there was grade 1 clubbing, and there was no familial clubbing observed in father and mother. There was no edema. Abdomen was, there was no localizing sign or localizing tenderness, but perianal area showed large anal tags, but there was no fissure. So please don't never forget about examining for the juniors, examining the perianal region, because that often might give you a very important clue whether you are dealing with IBD or not. So at this point, if this kind of girl is coming with fever and abdominal pain, would you suspect IBD? So what I would insist that somebody who has a long-drawn history of 5-6 months, you should suspect. It's better to exclude than not suspecting. So we did usual investigations. In our case also, the hemoglobin was low. ESL was quite high. CRP was still high, 30. Everything was normal, but we did a fecal calculative that was quite high. Again, Mantoux was negative, and X-ray, celiac screening, chest X-ray, everything was normal, and HIV was negative. Obviously, we always do HIV. It was done, but we repeated the serology. So we planned for endoscopic evaluation. We did a colonoscopy. As we entered, colon started having quite a lot of small ulcers. These are like aphthoid ulcers. You can see here, here. And there were some places where there are lots of aphthoid ulcers and few ulcers with big exudate, but there was not deep ulcers. And in between mucosa was normal. And here, this place, there are lots of ulcers actually, lots of aphthoid ulcers, like starry sky. So I was thinking, well, we are dealing with probably IBD. And even in the upper GI, there was small erosions. That was not very specific, but in one place it was very nodular. This kind of nodular appearance we often get even in H. pylori infection. So it's nothing really conclusive that we have to have an IBD here. And duodenum was relatively normal. There was no ulcer detected, and folds were also normal, and there was no scalloping. Even you know that scalloping is a presentation of celiac disease, but scalloping is also a presenting features of inflammatory bowel disease, even causal protein allergy, even any other immunodeficiencies also. There are 7-8 causes of duodenal scalloping for in the cases of whenever you find duodenal scalloping. So histopathology showed typical chronic active inflammation with incomplete granuloma. Here was a granuloma in colon, and everywhere there was chronic active inflammation. Even in stomach, there was focal active inflammation. Mind that whenever you will read any histopathological report, never ignore this focal thing. Often there are reports of focal inflammation, focal ulceration, focal this thing. So focal inflammation is a very early feature of inflammatory bowel disease. Mind that if somebody you are really suspecting that this child might evolve into inflammatory bowel disease, please never ignore this feature of focal inflammation, because everybody is not very expert in giving a report of chronic inflammation. Often they write that non-specific inflammation, but it depends on the histopathologist. But if you see that somebody is writing lots of focal inflammation, please don't ignore it and think that you might be dealing with a case of inflammatory bowel disease. So with this child was diagnosed as Crohn's disease, and it was Crohn's disease which involved colon mostly. Ileum was relatively normal. Small bowel imaging was normal, and there was stomach was also involved, and duodenum also showed some amount of inflammation. So it was upper disease as well as colonic disease. So it was mostly Crohn's colitis along with upper GI disease. So colitis cannot be only ulcerative colitis or typical other infectious colitis. So colitis typically might be also Crohn's. So with that, we move to the second case. 7-year-old boy moving from one doctor to another with history of diarrhea. He has diarrhea and he had 8 kg weight loss in 4 months. So so significant. But everybody was giving antibiotics. Here and there, everybody, whatever antibiotic was on earth, the child already had received when the child came to us. His albumin was 3.2, hemoglobin was 8.5, and he has profound weakness. He stopped going to school, he was not doing any activity, he was a singer, even he does not go to his music class. So these were the investigations. We can see that again CRP was slightly high, and here the albumin was 2.7 when we did it, and calprotectin was quite high, 1500. So we did plan looking inside, and MANTU was obviously negative and serology negative. And when we entered the upper GI endoscope at upper GI, then we found that in duodenum there are lots of aphthous ulcers. You can see the typical aphthous ulcers, what happens in mouth. So this has happened in duodenum, and in colon it started with small aphthous ulcers, become little bit deeper ulcers, and it became more deep with exudates here. You can see, and in between mucosa was normal. Always mind that in between mucosa we can see normal mucosa, but sometimes you can see this is a patchy distribution. This is very typical of Crohn's disease. So this child also had typical biopsy. There was no granuloma, but it was chronic active inflammation everywhere, and the small bowel was normal. And initially the problem is that initially we couldn't go to the ileum because the ileocecal valve was so tight. I thought that it might be a stricturus, but it was due to edema. It was very tight, but relatively ileum was free when we did the MR angiogram, and the child responded to the usual treatment very well. So with that we move to case 3. This case Prabhash knows very well. He also presented this case. It was very, very unusual presentation, but it's not very unusual. The disease can present like this. 13-year-old male suffering from pain of right hip joint along with low back pain since September. History of intermittent pain, swelling right knee joint since June 2013. Started on 12, then went to 2013. There was no history of trauma, no history of fever, rash, oral ulcer, or abdominal pain. Consulted many doctors, treated as septic arthritis. And somebody also said that it is lumbar radiculopathy. So patient was taken to a hospital in South in 2014. Mind that disease has started from 2012, already 2 years passed. So raised DSS, CRP, albumin low, that time it was found. MRI, people ignored all these facts, and they found that bilateral hip joint involvement, HLA-B27 positive, so he was diagnosed as enthesitis. related arthritis, and he was put on naproxen and sulfasalazine. Mind me, this sulfasalazine helped little bit this child, but after 2 months, due to 2012-14 again, he was admitted to a local hospital in Kolkata. He was admitted with fever, pain abdomen, generalized rash with pruritus, generalized edema, loss of appetite, swelling of right ankle joint, loose stools. And he was quite pale. There was distension of abdomen, and apparently we thought probably it was like features of peritonitis was there. And arthritis of right ankle joint was quite prominent. It was swollen. So ultrasound there showed mild ascites with hepatosplenomegaly. CT abdomen showed thick edematous, also asymmetric thinned out small gut loops, diffuse thick descending colon and sigmoid colon, mild ascites, mild hepatosplenomegaly with paraaortic loops. I don't know somebody who has reported this CT. It was so, and whoever had seen this patient, they diagnosed it. I don't know how they have diagnosed, how they have managed the patient. Whatever it was, they managed the child conservatively, received 2 units of blood transfusion, and the diagnosis they have made in the discharge was this: sealed peptic perforation with secondary bacterial peritonitis, enthesitis related HLA-B27 positive arthritis, but beta thalassemia trait was incidentally detected, and rash and diarrhea due to drug interaction and sulfasalazine with chloroquine. I don't know. I have never heard this. We also never heard this. So this happened, and we were actually, the child was referred to us and was ultimately admitted to us after 20 days of this discharge. The child was very unwell, inability to stand or walk, occasional pain abdomen, and loose stools. Patient was looking quite sick, quite apathetic. Weight was also less, 24 kg only. Mother was saying that his weight was initially 38 kg. He was quite a chubby boy, and he was quite tachycardic. Basically, he was not very well. And abdomen was little distended, but there was no organomegaly. And what we found is the right iliac fossa was little bit tender. So it was not like typical like acute appendicitis, which is among the whole other parts, right iliac fossa was a little bit tender. So we did the blood counts and everything, revealed a low hemoglobin, though the child 20 days ago received 2 units of blood transfusion. CRP was slightly high and everything was normal, but serology revealed the HbA positive status, but everything, the rest of the things were normal. Then I thought that with all the histories, we took the history once again from the very beginning. Actually, patient was having weight loss, which was with arthritis, that was really not taken into account. History of gastrointestinal problem like on and off diarrhea was always present, especially for last 6 months. That was not taken into account. Right iliac fossa pain and tenderness on last admission was there. Most likely it was perforated in the iliac fossa. That's why the child had peritonitis. Growth retardation was there. Anemia was always there, and history of pruritic rash, oral ulcer. All these were present for last few months. So if you don't know, if you don't think, if you don't suspect, it's very difficult to diagnose. So we plan to do endoscopy and colonoscopy. In colon, when I entered just beyond hepatic pressure, I couldn't go any further, and the appearance was like this. This was a visualizing part. Probably the child, the ulcer was perforated from this part, and colonic stricture was like there. I couldn't go. It was all fibrosed, and there were large, deep ulcers everywhere. You can see this ulcer, and this ulcer. This was the ulcer, and I couldn't go beyond after some time. So I was really scared to go anything because I could perforate this again. And ultimately, the histopathology showed chronic active inflammation with marked fibrosis, but there was no AFP, no granuloma, and it was nothing like typical tuberculosis. So, and this appearance was there. This child was undergone a barium mill follow through. That time, Dr. Shah was there, M.R. Shah, and he used to do this reporting, and he was really very expert in barium mill reporting. And there was typical signs were present: thickening of nodularity of small bowel, and you can see this. The cecal part is not visible. So I stopped here, as I told in colonoscopy, and cecum was pulled up, and deformed narrow lumen was there, and proximal ascending colon showed narrowing with ulcers. This part was ulcer. That part actually we did see. So this was very typical. Ultimately, the child, I thought that this child with a kind of fistulizing ulcer might need biologicals, and they were not well off at all, and they didn't have money. So I was really praying to God, this child should respond to the usual management, and God actually helped them. He responded well to the usual management, and he didn't need biological. Child is very well. This last year, actually, in November, the child became 18, and ultimately he was referred to PG hospital in the adult department. So with that, we move to case 4. This was an 8-year-old boy who had severe bloody diarrhea for 6 months. Loose stools with tenesmus. There was typical history of tenesmus were present. Not gaining weight with loss of energy. He dropped hemoglobin to 6 gram, and that's why he was transfused into a local hospital, and he was transfused 2 units of blood. There was no such family history, and when the child came to us, we saw a very small child whose height and weight were all very low, and emaciated child was looking pale. And this time also hemoglobin was 7.6 gram. His bloody diarrhea was continuing, CRP was quite high, and serology was negative, and colonoscopy revealed this appearance. Look at this appearance. This is a continuous area of very erythematous area, and these are ulcers, like superficial ulcers. And you can see these areas like very red. When the colonoscope touches the mucosa, it bleeds. Immediately it starts bleeding. So this is a very fragile mucosa with continuous superficial ulcers. You can't see any normal mucosa anywhere, no normal vascularity anywhere. This was typical appearance of ulcerative colitis, and his upper GI endoscopy was completely normal. So this child was having cryptitis, crypt abscess. There was no granuloma, chronic active inflammation everywhere with crypt distortion. Mind this word of crypt distortion that I will discuss about histopathology. So this is very important. Cryptitis, crypt abscess can be found in any infection. Any infection like any colitis, those who cause infections, those who cause colitis like E. coli, Shigella, Salmonella, all can cause cryptitis and crypt abscess. But crypt distortion, crypt branching, all these things are features of chronicity. Those are very typical of ulcerative colitis. So, what are the endoscopic features of Crohn's disease? So, you can see this kind of features. If there are like lots of nodular appearance, this is called cobblestoning. So, this is one of the features of endoscopy. So, there can be small ulcers, as I've shown, small ulcers, acquired ulcers, and in between mucosa was normal. You can see in between vascularity, and this kind of ulcers, penetrating ulcers, or that kind of visualizing appearance, or it can be very deep ulcer with exudate. So these are typical appearances. And often these appearances in cecum is, people might say this child might be suffering from tuberculosis. And to differentiate Crohn's disease and tuberculosis, it's a big chapter. We can discuss it any day again later on. But in general, Crohn's disease has generalized appearance, then upper GI appearance, and typical appearance of tuberculosis is sickle and ileal appearance. And if somebody is having left colonic involvement as you are doing the colonoscopy, then there is more chance that this will be a Crohn's disease than intestinal tuberculosis. So we have seen many patients who had typical lesions in left and transverse colon as well as ileum and cecum, but people were treated with tubercular anti-tubercular medication. They respond a little bit, but it recurs after 3 months or so. So that's why if you have doubt, always do it again, repeat the colonoscopy after 3 months giving a TT if you are really not very sure about your diagnosis. So this is typical histology. The typical histology, if we say that this is chronic active inflammation. So there will be active inflammatory part like neutrophilic infiltration, but more will be plasma cells, more will be lymphocytes, more will be eosinophils. And if you find a granuloma, usually it's an incomplete granuloma, non-caseating granuloma, and usually situated in the superficial, in the mucosa. Usually, if it is tubercular granuloma, it is usually situated in the submucosa, and tubercular granulomas are usually bigger compared to the Crohn's disease granuloma. So it is, in general, this is the difference, and usually it's an incomplete granuloma. So this is, if you find this kind of features, then it's a Crohn's disease. But you can also may find focal inflammation, focal chronic inflammation amidst normal mucosa. Then also you have to suspect, because all early features start with focal inflammation and then they proceed to the typical chronic inflammation, chronic active inflammation. So you have to be very careful. I told you that if you find a picture of focal inflammation, please don't ignore that. So what are the endoscopic features of ulcerative colitis? I have already pointed out continuous appearance. You can't see any interruption whenever you are finding the inflammation. Continuous erythema. Look at this. There's no normality at all. There is not a lot of bleeding. But here also superficial ulceration and the mucosa is not at all. It's lost its vascularity. And it is continuously lost. So this is also continuously lost at granular mucosa. This is ulcerative colitis. And but if this kind of inflammation might be patchy, if it is there present there, but then again it was not there, then again it was present after 4-5 centimeters, then it might be Crohn's colitis. So this is typical ulcerative colitis histology. Crypt distortion, crypt abscess. These are like crypt abscess. Usually it's found just below the crypts, and lots of abscesses are usually found. But these are not typical features. In any infection, it is found that, as I told. But if you really want to look at the features of chronicity, this is called architectural distortion and crypt branching, abnormal crypts, and there are loss of crypts. There are usually within a millimeter. There are lots of like 5-6 crypts are seen, but usually that is lost. Lots of more distances between the crypts, so that is features of chronicity because there is crypt atrophy. And very typical appearance if there is Paneth cell metaplasia. Paneth cell metaplasia is an appearance, usually Paneth cells are not present beyond hepatic flexure. If you take a sample from right colon, you cannot see Paneth cells normally. But if you find Paneth cells in the right colon, there is chronic inflammation. And neuronal hypertrophy, if a very good histopathologist is there, they can find out. But ulcerative colitis, all the inflammation usually ends before the superficial layer of muscularis mucosa. Mind that it never goes down. Any inflammation, any chronic inflammation, if it has gone down beyond muscularis mucosa and has gone very deep, it is not ulcerative colitis, it will be Crohn's colitis. So these are the typical features you can find in your textbook, the differentiating point. But mind that the important points I want to point out: abdominal mass, abdominal pain, and growth failure. Always suspect Crohn's disease. And appearance and stomach, upper GI symptoms, more common in Crohn's. And fistulas, fissures, all are strictures, very common in Crohn's. It's never present in ulcerative colitis. It might present in very rare cases in ulcerative colitis, but it's usually not. And granulomas. Obviously, ulcerative colitis is never present. And skip lesions, as I have already said, patchy lesions, it's more feature, and transmural involvement, deep involvement. This is typical of Crohn's disease. And what is not present in Crohn's? Toxic metabolism. We never see toxic metabolism in Crohn's. And sclerosing cholangitis, more present in cases of ulcerative colitis. Percentage-wise, in adult, it is 13%, 13 to 14%. But if somebody has sclerosing cholangitis, 85% of them has ulcerative colitis. So the association is like that. In Crohn's disease also there is sclerosing cholangitis, but 6 to 8% it is present. It is more association with ulcerative colitis. Small bowel imaging. This is very important because previously people never used to do, because previously adults used to only deal with IBD, and they never used to do small bowel evaluation. They never used to do upper GI evaluation. But upper GI involvement is more common in pediatric diseases. So we always have to do upper GI endoscopy whenever we do colonoscopy and endoscopy. And we always do small bowel imaging because the staging of the disease then we may not do that. So that's why small bowel imaging is very essential. We can do an MR or CT for very small children. We can do a capsule endoscopy if the child can swallow a capsule, or if parents prefer capsule endoscopy, we can insert the capsule through the endoscope while doing the endoscopy. But often we find this is good to have MR or CT before that, because often there is very edematous narrowing and often the capsule gets stuck there. So capsule stuck with the OD of the child, and this is not really good for us. So that's why actually it's better to do an MR imaging, and if you are really suspicious, then you can go for capsule or enteroscopy that to find out the answer. Capsule does not have the advantage to take a biopsy sample. But enteroscopy has the advantage. But enteroscopy takes a little bit more time. It takes about half an hour to see the whole small bowel, half an hour to 45 minutes, depending on the expertise. But the advantage is that we can take the biopsy from it. But if we have already taken a biopsy and we have proved the diagnosis, just to see the extent of disease, MR.CT enterocolitis is excellent. We have. So in here actually E1 is only proctitis, E2 is left-sided or distal, and E3 is pancolitis. So many times, most of the time we get pancolitis. Isolated proctitis is not very common in pediatric, but it's really present in adult, very few, and their treatment is very easy. And S1, S1, S2, and S3 is present. That is with systemic symptoms. S1, S2 with 4 stools per day. These are the different stages, and along with systemic features of temperature, hemoglobin concentration low, and ESR more. These are S3. So you can stage according to that, or you can write only E1, E2, E3 along with systemic features, whatever were present. And in pediatric, we have ulcerative colitis activity index, which is very, very clinical and we often use, especially when patient present with severe acute colitis. And in this case, we have these symptoms. Our ward always have this chart, and we fill up the chart when the patient present with severe acute colitis. And if the score is more than 65, the child is really very unwell, and we have to vigorously treat it. Every day we score it and see whether score is coming down. If the score is coming down below 45, then the child is improving, and if it is less than 35, the child has improved, responded to treatment. So within 3 days, we reassess. If it does not respond, we change the treatment. We start with steroids if it is the first presentation of severe acute colitis, and then we start with steroids, and if it is not really responding, we can go to cyclosporine or biologicals. And sometimes in severe cases, if the patient cannot afford biologicals, you can go for surgery as well, total colectomy. So we have also classification of Crohn's disease. So previously people used to follow Vienna classification, but now we do the Montreal classification. And we have a photo group also we have classified accordingly, but that's very complicated. But Montreal is good. So according to age of onset, this was like, because it's combined adult and pediatric, but disease location wise, if it is ideal, colonic, ileocolonic along with upper disease. You can write L1, L2 plus L4. L3 plus L4, like that. And if it is non-stricturing, non-penetrating, then you have to write B1. But if it is stricturing and penetrating, you have to write B3. And if there is perianal disease, then you have to write P, along with whatever stage you have written. This is behavior. So we have a Crohn's disease activity index as well, but that actually involves some investigation like ESR, anemia, and the child's growth. So that needs little bit time to assess, and all the time, last 1 week's investigation we have to put. But here actually the course is like not present 0, but 5 and 10, not present 0, 5, 10. So that you can fill up and see how the child is. And here you can see that in Crohn's disease, the profound weakness. Weakness is one of the most important symptoms. And weight and height should always be measured. So it's not like purely only symptomatic like ulcerative colitis activity index. But in outpatient, we can do it when the child comes with the investigations. So perianal disease, this is very, very important. So I always said that never forget to examine the perianal side, and there might be abscesses, there might be fistula and fissures, and this will give you immediate hint that you are dealing with some IPT. And 10% of children actually present with Crohn's disease, with perianal disease. So there might be fistulas in different tract, and wherever there is fistula, we're suspecting perianal disease, we have to do an MRI. Plain MRI can actually look at the fistula tract normally, but if it is very complicated, sometimes we may need to give some contrast with the fistula, from the fistula. So these are the extraintestinal manifestation of IBD. You can have uveitis and episcleritis. Always ask for it because child might have some symptoms before and has responded to some steroid eye drop, because often ophthalmologists give steroid eye drop and it does respond. But actually there was some inner disease which was going on. They can have erythema nodosum. More is present in Crohn's disease than ulcerative colitis, and this is scleroderma is more present in ulcerative colitis than Crohn's, but it can present in both. This is typical MRI of sclerosing cholangitis. This is ERCP. And as I have told you earlier, the association. And oral disease, obviously, always take the history of Akhtal ulceration. Please take the history. Often we have seen 1 year the child was having repeated Akhtal ulceration, and then after 1 year the child presented with IBD. So differential diagnosis, I have said, infectious colitis, intestinal tuberculosis, HIV-associated enteropathy. Like that, our second patient presented with only diarrhea. There was no abdominal pain, only diarrhea. So that's why we always do HIV. Any patient presenting with chronic diarrhea, always look for albumin, always look exclude HIV. So immunodeficiency associated enteropathies, these are usually, especially below 2 years or below 6 years, early onset, very early onset IBD. And amoebic colitis, giardiasis, all can be differentiated if we carefully examine the stool. You can do serology if you have really any conclusion. Usually we don't have any conclusion because we don't have typical chronic features of ulcerative colitis in all these. Allergic enterocolitis in young children below 2 years, even the allergic colitis can be looking same like ulcerative colitis, severe ulcers. And but the features are usually showing chronic inflammation with lots of eosinophils. Usually they have more than 30 or 35 eosinophils per 100 feet. This is the Espegan algorithm. And they always, when there is suspicion, they do ileocolonoscopy and upper GI endoscopy, and you see proceed accordingly. And all the time you can see that MRE has been done to see the small bowel. And whenever there is suggestion, according to that, you can see with the histopathology, you can conclude. And if we have some features like you have typical colitis-like features in the colon, but you have inflammation in the upper tract as well, and the disease behavior you cannot really define it, then we say it IBDU. Many of these IBDU ultimately evolve as Crohn's disease. So what we have found in our studies. So pediatric IBD, never think that it's same as the adult disease, because severity of disease is often very, very severe. Growth is very important factor, because if you cannot control the disease well, your growth will be really hampered. Even in acute Crohn's disease, after optimal treatment, even we don't achieve the goal, sexual maturation will not be achieved if you don't treat the disease well. Health supervision is very important. Psychosocial well-being and healthcare provider transition. Transitioning is not present in our country, so it becomes very difficult. All the patients always, parents always request us, please keep the patient with you, be it 18 years, be it 19 years, but we cannot see them throughout through adulthood. Someday we have to really transfer them to the adults, and they usually initially never become happy, but ultimately they adapt themselves. So they're not only small adults, because adolescents IBD have more extensive involvement, and childhood onset Crohn's, as I have said, that it is often very severe and often associated with immunodeficiency. So most idiopathic IBD in children under the age of 5 years, especially if you find that they're very difficult to control and they're having frequent relapses, please mind that you have to really rule out immunodeficiency. And it is better to do whole exome sequencing or clinical exome than going through extensive inflammatory, like all immunodeficiency disorder, because that actually wastes a lot of money, but still we may not conclude. So whole exome sequencing is much better. So these are the usual diagnoses, but there are a big list you can see in your textbook in Nelson. Also, there is a big list of monogenic disorders which can be differentiating from the very early onset IBD. So CGD, we have one patient, glycogen storage disease. What we recently we diagnosed other patient. This child may present as IBD few days later. Mind that, Prabhash. Harmonously, Pudlak, Nemo. Nemo is a diagnosis which has been actually coined by the Great Ormond Street people. Scott Aldrich, IPEX, hyper IgM, and lots of other immunodeficiency also. All these autoimmune lymphoproliferative disorder all may present with early onset IBD. Growth failure. Always mind about somebody who is presenting with some amount of diarrhea, chronic diarrhea, or abdominal pain, and who is not growing. Please never forget to exclude this, because it's better to exclude from the very beginning than delaying, because once we delay, sometimes treatment becomes very, very difficult. And other factors which might be responsible for growth is that steroids, lots of repeated uses of steroids, inadequate calorie intake, and lots of malabsorption which was present beforehand, and it's very difficult to compensate if the disease is not well controlled. So these many factors are responsible for the growth failure in Crohn's disease, and it's more prominent in Crohn's disease. And if you see that suddenly the growth, somebody who was growing well and sudden growth is going down, especially at the age of 8 to 10 years or 8 to 12 years, please mind about Crohn's disease. So what is the management? We have diagnosed all these patients. We have chronic diarrhea type of presentation of Crohn's disease. We have abdominal pain presentation of Crohn's disease. We have arthropathy presentation of Crohn's disease. We can have many other presentations of Crohn's disease. But what is the management? This is our treatment goal. We have to maximize our adherence and minimize the toxicity. This is our ultimate goal. So we have step up and step down approach. The step up approach, we starts with 5-ASA antibiotics. Antibiotics we often start with whenever we do endoscopy, colonoscopy, whenever we are suspecting IBD, because antibiotics has a role, because many patients come with repeated course of antibiotics. Why does it help? Because antibiotics lessens the inflammation. So sometimes that's why the patient have a good period for 2 weeks and then again they relapse. So that's why ultimately they come to us. So initially antibiotics you can give some response, but this is not typical response, typical agent which will really reduce the inflammation. 5-ASAs really can reduce the inflammation because that has happened for that patient with arthropathy. Sulfasalazine has made some response probably and was a little bit well and then ultimately before the ulcer perforated. And nutritional therapy. Nutritional therapy is very important for Crohn's disease. This is the initial line of management. And we can induce the induction either with nutritional therapy or with steroids in cases of Crohn's disease. But with ulcerative colitis, nutritional therapy does not work. So we have to induce the remission with steroids and 5 days. Then we maintain with immunomodulation. And if we have repeated relapse and this is not controlled, then we have biologics. This is step-up approach. But in step-down approach, we directly go with the vigorous treatment. We start with biologics. So we achieve microscopic healing quickly. With biologics, we can achieve microscopic healing within 8 to 12 weeks. So that's why often, especially in USA, they often go for biologics from the very beginning and then they maintain it with immunomodulators, or they have steroids in between, and that role is very ill-defined when you start with biologics. But if you have somebody to pay for your biologics, then biologics are very good and very well tolerated. And if they respond well, then it is very good. But if they don't respond well, then you have ultimately come down to many other therapies. So in Crohn's disease, mild disease, we start with aminosalicylate, but we never do it with aminosalicylate because only aminosalicylate does not really work in Crohn's disease. But with ulcerative colitis, only proctitis, only aminosalicylate will do. It can induce, it can maintain. In moderate to severe, we always start with either enteral feeds or corticosteroids. Enteral feeds, I will tell you later on, and or corticosteroids. Both of these can induce remission, and after that, we maintain with immunomodulation, either any of these three. And then we can induce biologic at any point if there is relapse. In cases of ulcerative colitis, we start with steroids and aminosalicylates. And if it is very mild disease, we can maintain with only aminosalicylates. And ideally, usually we maintain with all pancreatitis, immunomodulators, and aminosalicylates. So that is the usual response. And ulcerative colitis relatively does better until it's a very severe colitis. So exclusive enteral nutrition, few words about it, because this is a nutritional therapy. Typical we used to do with Modulen in Western countries, and we give this exclusive diet for 6 to 8 weeks. It can be polymeric, it can be elemental diet, but patient will only take this and water for 6 to 8 weeks, and this will ultimately induce remission, and they really does very well. And then we start at the end of 6 weeks, we start with the immunomodulators and continue the remission, maintain the remission with the immunomodulators. We calculate the amount for each patient, give a protein of 1.5 grams, start with 1 gram per kg, because often they have nutritional deprivation and they should not have refeeding. So gradually we build up the protein and calorie, and ultimately it is achieved within 1 or 2 weeks, and ultimately it is maintained for 6 to 8 weeks. So this actually helps with increasing calorie intake, and it has anti-inflammatory properties. But if you ask me how does it work, we don't know. Actually, we don't know. And it might be modifying the gut microflora and thereby inducing inflammation, reducing inflammation, or directly acts as anti-inflammatory. There are several mechanisms described, but we really don't know, but it does. And these are the usual 2 diets which are used, mostly Modulen IBD, and sometimes elemental this 0 to 8 we previously used to use, but now model and IBD. Here now we have used in India several polymeric diets, several peptide-based diets as well, and that has given some response. We have few studies which are coming for publications, but small number of patients, like 25 patients, because patients actually don't want to go to this nutritional therapy. After 2 weeks, they give up. I have tried 2, 3 patients, but after 2, 3 weeks, they gave up. Then ultimately, I have to again start them on steroids. So aminosalicylates, we have different preparation. We use mesalamine mostly. All valproxide and osalazine is not available. We don't use it. And sulfasalazine, often people use, especially those who are associated with some arthritic component that helps better. The steroid therapy, obviously, we induce with 1.5 gram per kg and give it for 6 weeks and taper it over another 6 weeks. And in the meantime, we start the azathioprine or 6-methoxypyrin, and then that takes over within 8 weeks and that maintain. And there are studies with enteral nutrition versus prednisolone. Obviously, enteral nutrition did much better in Crohn's disease, but still it's sometimes difficult to incorporate in patient's mind, and especially parents' mind. So it becomes difficult. But we have to really go for enteral nutrition more, because that's more rational and that has not got any side effects. Immunomodulators, we can choose any of these, but we have to have the TPMT phenotype before that. We always do that. But still mind that even if you have a normal TPMT phenotype, still they can have neutropenia and other complications. So you have to really go for the blood counts initially weekly, then 2 weeks, and then 3 months. And once they're settled, then you may do it twice a year. So these are the for marcapribulin maintaining remission. It's good. These are the side effects. We have one patient who actually we lost with severe neutropenia. It might, we don't know whether it was due to azathioprine, but it might be a total mediated bone marrow depletion. We really don't know, but the child was lost due to severe infection. Then third, we have biologicals. Biologicals are agents. We know that cytokine modulators, which inhibit the pro-inflammatory cytokine TNF alpha, but we have several other inflammatory mediator modifying biologicals. The initial was infliximab, which was used. Then adalimumab has come, which is fully humanized. This was chimeric, and it has actually a rate of 13% antibody production. Adalimumab has a very low 4 to 6% antibody production, so the response is long lasting. These are different biologicals, but how given infliximab infusion, adalimumab subcutaneous, that's why people choice for that. We don't have true adalimumab available. We have biosimilars available for adalimumab, but infliximab is available, everybody knows. And other biologicals which are coming into play, like vedolizumab, which is very good. It is alpha-4 beta-7 integrin, and which is very good in Crohn's disease. And the more advantage of this is that the immunosuppression is very, very less for this vedolizumab. So people are preferring vedolizumab. It was supposed to come in this April, but I think it has halted due to this lockdown and thing. We will get at the end of this year, we will get vedolizumab in our country, but obviously we don't know the cost. It will be quite costly. We have several other agents. Few are also orally available. All trials are going on. Several other small pilot studies as well as randomized control trials are going on now with these derivatives. Whatever will act better, then ultimately probably we will get it in near future. So probably these are the future, but if we treat it, if we start diagnosing it early, I think we can do with the traditional treatment. We have several IBD patients who are really doing well with traditional treatment, and we have only 10 to 20% patients who are needing these higher agents. But is there any indication of surgery in Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis? Indications are coming less and less because biologicals are available now. But still, if we have a failure, recurrent obstruction or perforation, fistula, or severe growth retardation where you are really not able to control the disease, and in adult cases, especially carcinoma, we have to go for surgery. There are not a lot of Indian data. We have completed our IBD data. Actually, this is under process of publication now. It's now getting the modifications and corrections for publications. There also we found that in South we have more Crohn's disease. In East we have more Crohn's disease, but in Northern area we still have more ulcerative colitis. But Crohn's disease is definitely increasing over the time. This was one of the survey. This was a few small studies quite long back, and this was a questionnaire survey that was also early 2000. That time we didn't have any Eastern India data. We have few Eastern India data. Here we showed an incidence of 1.4 per 10,000 children, new cases every year. And we published 4 arthritis as a presentation of IBD from our place. And to summarize that, we can say that IBD, we have to suspect IBD whenever there is bloody diarrhea, which is longer, persisting more than 2 to 3 weeks, and chronic and recurrent diarrhea, abdominal pain, which is chronic. So whenever we have all these symptoms along with these red flag symptoms and signs. What are the red flag symptoms? Nocturnal pain, involuntary weight loss, unexplained fever, joint pain and skin rash, third patient, deceleration of linear growth, significant vomiting, repeated abscess ulcers. And we have signs like significant pallor, abdominal tenderness or mass, erythema nodosum, uveitis, perianal disease, and along with investigational findings like ESR, high CRP, low albumin, and increased fecal calprotectin. Please exclude IBD, because if you exclude it earlier, be proactive to exclude, then it's much better than to sit on it and diagnose it very, very late. So to conclude that IBD in a young should be diagnosed early. Management approach should be well focused and discussed with parents. You can discuss with them about biologicals, about nutrition, about steroid and everything along with side effects, and they can give you a choice along with their financial ability. Biologicals should be considered for fistulizing and stricturing disease. Please tell them from the very beginning that with steroids you won't be able to achieve the ultimate end for this kind of disease. And very early onset disease should be investigated for immunodeficiencies. Explanation for the course of the disease reduced doctor shopping in our country, but still we cannot stop them shopping from one drug to other. Surgical indications are less, but should be administered in appropriate indications whenever it's needed, and it should be on time, not very late. Thank you so much for your kind attention. So any question for the junior?
Thank you, Bhashyate.
Yes.
It was a very, very good presentation. Crisp and clear message. Very nice.
So all our inflammatory bowel disease patients usually get a course of anti-TB drugs. So is it really possible to diagnose by only doing an endoscopy without a biopsy? So in every case, I think you need a biopsy to distinguish between. But
See,
just by looking,
if you have somebody who is presenting with like abscess, peritonitis, typical doughy appearance, then we don't have like any doubt of tuberculosis. But if it is pure intestinal presentation, you have to have an endoscopy and have to have a biopsy. And you send for typical, because even detecting AFB, it's not really worth it, because only 20% it is present. Even TB-PCR is not absolute; it's 25 to 30%. It can exclude. So, but we have to amalgamate all the features like small bowel imaging. Here comes the importance of MRE. MR angiogram has made revolution actually. Last time we had in this Pericon, we had this lecture. First and foremost importance is that always do ileocolonoscopy along with upper GI endoscopy. So upper GI endoscopy, if somebody has typical chronic inflammation with granuloma in upper GI, so it cannot be anything other than Crohn's disease, because in stomach, in duodenum,
you don't have TB.
It's really, I mean,
very unlikely, very unlikely.
And we have a study from SGPGI. Anshu has published that it was more left colonic disease, more incomplete granuloma, and more upper GI involvement. These three features, if it is associated, you don't have any doubt. Never put the child on TB, tuberculosis. But if it is only ileocecal involvement, there was no upper GI involvement, there was no left colonic involvement, and if you really have in doubt in the appearance as well, then you can put the child on ATD. But after 3 months, please do a rescope. If you don't reassess, if you reassess in tuberculosis, you will find most of the inflammation has subsided. But if it is Crohn's disease, it won't subside. It will still show the features of typical chronic inflammation. And even the ulcer stays.
Okay.
that is another class actually, TB and interstitial tuberculosis. So interstitial tuberculosis and Crohn's disease. So it's another session. Anybody, any junior having?
Bhashwati, nice presentation. So my question is, your Crohn's and extraintestinal manifestation, how common is the eye involvement in pediatric IBD?
We didn't find actually quite a lot in our study also. The pediatric IBD data that will come out, it was actually very less. It was less than 3%. It was less than 3%, something like 2 point something. In total of, we have included 350 patients. So from different places, multi-center study, it was less than 3%. We don't find many, but we do regular checkup obviously. But we have more arthritis, we have more erythema nodosum, we have sclerosing cholangitis more, but that is also quite less than 2%.
Bhashwati, I have a chat box ta dekhben, ekta question ache.
Bhashwati, I have some work, I'm leaving. Good presentation, nice.
Any role of probiotics? Well, still now
Hello.
we have, somebody has done this question. Thank you for the question, Devopama. Probiotics, still now we don't have typical role in treating IBD. It's still not defined, but we have role of in pouchitis when we do the ileocolony canal anastomosis in cases of ulcerative colitis. Then in those cases, repeated pouchitis can be prevented, and the two probiotics have been studied. One is BSL-3, that is a combination of 3, actually in total 8 different probiotics. And we have Econom, that is Saccharomyces. That these are the 2 things which are studied, and they have definitive role in prevention and treatment of pouchitis. But to treat IBD only with probiotics, it's not never recommended. You cannot do it.
Bhashwati, one more question.
Bhashwati,
Yes.
you have
Hello.
Bhashwati, you have shown all the cases in the range of 6-7 years. So what is your experience in the lower age group?
Very low, very early onset. Just actually, I've lost this thing. Early onset. Can you hear me? Early onset, very early onset. I have 3 patients with very early onset who have several things. One is this. I think Priyankar and Prabhash can remember. This was a patient, Shashanko. We lost this patient. He went to AIIMS and he had a colonic perforation. This patient has familial Mediterranean fever in the gene study. Another, we have a CGD who responded well to treatment, but he had chronic granulomatous disease. But in I didn't find, I am doing quite a lot of clinical exam nowadays. For last 2 years, I have done like 20 to 30 patients with IBD, very early onset clinical exam, but I didn't find lots of gene, whether it's a genetic study problem with the center or I don't know. But one of my colleagues in Hyderabad, they have found quite a lot. He has found Scott Aldrich 2 IL-10 receptor mutation. Whoever I think that IL-10 receptor mutation, I don't find them, but they have found 2, and they have also found another, I think, lymphoproliferative disorder. They had to go for bone marrow transplant. So,
Okay.
so these, and he also found one of this CD55 deficiency, who has presented with less than 6 years. All these patients have actually had a very poor growth. They present 3 to 4 or 5 years or so, 5 to 6 years, and they have all these features. But I didn't find, I have below 6 years, but a lot of IBD. Even this patient who had fever, she was also below 6 years, 5 years something, around 6 years. So still her clinical exam didn't reveal anything.
Okay.
Bhashwati, I have got one question. Your association of HLA-27 with IBD,
Yes.
how many cases?
Recently, I have one patient presented with arthritis. He had one HLA mutation, and this is only 2 I have so far. When we presented this four patients, I had only one HLA, this child only, HLA-27. But recently, one has been added just during the lockdown.
And presentation was sacroiliitis.
This patient has sacroiliitis, but the other patient had actually some amount of spine pain, but his main arthritis was in it was enthesitis in ankle. His main pain was in ankle, but some amount of spinal pain.
Okay. Thank you.
Hello. Hello, I'm Bonali. Hello.
Yes, Bob. আমি
হ্যাঁ আচ্ছা না না ঠিক আছে one question we get perianal skin tag commonly in constipation also right so is it the size right 5 millimeter it should be more than 5 millimeter so is it the size which matters or the distribution or any other point
If it is elephant tag, that is more associated with IBD, more than 5 millimeter or sometimes 10 to 15 millimeter even. So if it is very big tag, whenever if you find a small tag, it's fine. It might be constipation, but if it is a very big one, you can find that whatever is the symptom, but the tag is quite big.
constipation yeah
Of IBD.
okay okay thank you
Thank you, Ashwini. Very good presentation.
Anybody? I can't find the chat because it is my screen has become black. I can't see the chat box as well.
না আর কোনো কোয়েশ্চেন নেই চ্যাটে
Hey, na?
Okay.
ঠিক আছে.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nupurti. Thank you so much, Dr. Kundu. Thank you, everybody, whoever has listened. I'm very happy that you have listened to this.
thank you Bhashwati it was very nice